Tonight, you're walking through a room that doesn't shout when it's dangerous. It whispers. It leaves the lamps low. It lets the street sound cover the important conversations. And if your room is still, let it stay that way. No rush, no sharp edges. Just slow breath and a story that moves like water and a fountain that never gets tired. Tonight, you're going to hear about 3 things. A bottle that doesn't look like power, a network that hides inside ordinary shopping, and the strange Roman talent for turning fear into routine. If you like this kind of slow history, the kind you can fall asleep and say, tap like, subscribe, or follow softly, only if you feel like it. And in a whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now, picture the smallest stage possible. Not the Forum, not the Senate. A doorway at dusk. A shop that smells like resin and bruised herbs. A shelf lined with jars that look innocent enough to belong to anyone. Oils for joints, powders for cloth, pastes for skin, little bundles of dried roots that promise comfort. The people who walk in aren't wearing villain capes. They're wearing the face you wear when you want help but don't want questions. The face that says, I'm just browsing, even when the heart is doing paperwork. Because Rome is loud about some dangerous steel politics, someone yelling your name across a courtyard. But at home, the anxieties are often quieter. A fever that arrives politely. A stomach that turns with no warning. A weakness that behaves exactly like ordinary bad luck. And bad luck is convenient. Bad luck doesn't testify. It doesn't leave a receipt. It doesn't show up in court in a toga and explain itself in clear Latin. So the city grows a shadow economy that isn't always called a shadow. It's just solutions, a remedy, a cosmetic, a pest control trick, a sleeping draft. Sometimes, depending on who's asking and what they're willing to pretend, a solution with a sharper purpose. The unsettling part is that the objects don't change much. It's the dosage. It's the intent. It's who gets to tell the story afterward. And this is where Rome becomes very modern, in the worst way. The same marketplace that sells comfort can also sell plausible deniability. The same hands that measure out perfume can measure out something that makes a rival's breath feel tired. The same ingredients can be kindness on Tuesday and a rumor on Wednesday. Nothing needs to be dramatic for it to be powerful. It just needs to be ordinary enough to pass through a door without being noticed. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let's start with the bottle behind the curtain. A cork turns with a tiny, patient squeak, like it has all night and nowhere to be. A bronze spoon taps the rim of a glass once, then again, as if it's checking whether the world is still solid. Somewhere nearby, a street fountain keeps running in the background, doing the most reliable job in Rome, making the same sound forever without asking to be thanked. And while that water keeps its small promise, you can let your eyes soften a little, let your shoulders sink, and just quietly, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Ancient Rome had many loud dangers, the kind that arrive wearing armor and opinions. But the dangers people worried about at home were often the quiet ones, the kind that arrive as a fever that can't quite explain itself, a stomach that decides it's tired of being brave, a weakness that looks on paper exactly like bad luck, and bad luck is very convenient because bad luck doesn't testify. It doesn't leave fingerprints. It doesn't show up to court in a toga and say, actually, it was the neighbor. That soft uncertainty created a market. Not a market with banners and trumpets, but a market with jars, with powders, with oils that smell comforting right up until they don't. Rome was full of solutions, and the word is doing a lot of work there. A solution might mean a face cream, a cough syrup, a dye for cloth, a paste for a wound, or a little something to persuade pests to live somewhere else. It might also mean the darker kind of persuasion, the kind people don't write down in household accounts unless they enjoy stress. The first secret of what you might call a poison economy is that it doesn't sit neatly in one moral box. It overlaps. The same ingredients can be a remedy on Tuesday and a rumor on Wednesday, depending on dose, intent, and who is telling the story after the fact. And Rome loved stories after the fact. When a person felt unwell, the mind did what minds do. It looked for meaning. Was it the wine? Was it the new cook? Was it the old friend who smiled too politely? Was it the gods? Sometimes it really was the gods, at least in the sense that if you eat questionable oysters and then go for a long walk in the sun, the universe has made a decision for you. But sometimes the fear wasn't about what happened. It was about how easy it would be for something to have happened. That is a very Roman anxiety. Also, if we're being honest, a very modern one. It is the feeling you get when you realize your phone knows your location and you didn't exactly sign a blood oath about it. You clicked agree half asleep, which is a charming detail for a bedtime history series. So if you wanted to find this shadowy world, you didn't go to a villain in a cloak. Cloaks were common. You'd be there all day, just watching people buy bread while wearing cloaks, which is not the thrilling investigation people imagine. You found ingredients through ordinary supply chains, the same way you find anything through people who sell things and people who know people who sell things. Rome had herbalists, perfumers, drug sellers, healers, midwives, and practical old relatives who had a strong opinion about every leaf. Markets offered dried roots and resins and little lumps of mystery with labels that sounded reassuringly scientific, or reassuringly religious, or both. Kitchens offered oils and wines that would carry whatever someone stirred into them, like loyal little vehicles with no ethical compass. A poison network could hide in plain sight because, from a distance, it looked like shopping. It also looked like health, and beauty, and cleanliness. Rome had a love affair with smell, and smell is a very sleepy topic because it's always there. And it never asks you to solve anything. Perfume wasn't just luxury. It was hygiene, mood, status, ritual, and sometimes pure theater. A tiny bottle could hold rose and resin and something sharp enough to make you feel like a new person. The line between medicine and cosmetic was not a line anyone painted neatly. If you wanted your skin to look calm, your breath to smell respectable, your hair to behave like a citizen, you needed substances. Some of those substances were gentle. Some of them were strong. And Rome, like many societies, respected strength right up until it became inconvenient. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part where a stranger sells powdered certainty in a crowded marketplace, you can subscribe. Or don't. The fountains of Rome will continue either way, and they will not be checking analytics. Now, the people who made this economy work were rarely the obvious ones. A seller rarely met the client directly because directness is for poetry, not for plausible deniability. A friend of a friend did the asking. A messenger carried a small bundle in a cloth that could be explained as anything. A purchase could be disguised as a remedy for sleep, anxiety, stomach trouble, fertility, or a rival's health, said with that careful tone that never fully commits to meaning. Vagueness was not a flaw. Vagueness was the product. It protected the buyer, the seller, and the middle hands all at once, like a soft blanket woven from incomplete sentences. Rome had many middle hands. Servants moved between households the way air moves between rooms, quietly, constantly, and carrying information without trying. Freed people ran errands, delivered messages, managed small shops, and listened, because listening was part of surviving. In a city where status was a staircase and everyone was standing on someone's foot, secrets were currency. The whisper economy and the bottle economy overlapped beautifully. A household might not admit it wanted something dangerous, but it might admit it wanted something discreet. And discreet is a word that can mean almost anything if you say it slowly enough. The truly sleepy part is the logistics. Not the drama, not the scandal, but the way small transactions become systems. A jar in one shop becomes a jar in another shop because jars travel. A familiar face at a stall becomes a familiar face in a corridor because Rome was large and also somehow everyone knew everyone's cousin. A few repeated purchases of help, of tonics, of special mixtures, of something for the rats, of something for the nerves create a rhythm. And when a rhythm exists, someone will monetize it, not loudly, just steadily, like a fountain. But the social cost of all this often landed unevenly because fear likes easy targets. Roman anxieties frequently attached poison to women, especially outsiders, poor women or women with medical knowledge. Midwives and healers could be respected in private and suspected in public because their work touched birth and sex and blood, three things societies love to need and also love to blame. If a powerful man died suddenly, rumor went searching for a convenient hand to accuse, and poison was a story people already knew how to tell. It didn't even need new vocabulary. It needed only a familiar villain shape. And if you're listening with sleepy eyes and thinking, yes, people still do that, yes. We still prefer a neat culprit over a complicated truth. We still look for someone who must have done it because uncertainty feels like an open window at night. Rome was full of open windows, literally and metaphorically, and gossip moved through them like a draft, carrying the same old patterns with a new accent. Of course, Rome did have laws. Rome loved laws. Rome could write a law about almost anything, and if it couldn't, it would borrow law from somewhere else and pretend it had always been there. But proving poison was hard when symptoms could mimic disease and bodies were buried quickly, especially in hot weather, especially among people who did not get the luxury of extended medical curiosity. Accusations often relied on motives, grudges, and who was present at a cup, not on anything you could measure. And because proof was slippery, trials became theatrical. Witnesses spoke, enemies testified, reputations collapsed in public, because in Rome, the crowd was always part of the legal process, at least emotionally. Sometimes the accusation was the weapon, even if no poison existed. To suggest poison was to suggest intent, secret planning, and moral rot. It made a rival look clever in the worst way. It turned ordinary sickness into a suspicious narrative, and suspicious narratives are very reusable. You can pour them into different cups, and they still taste the same. And there's a strange comfort in that if you like being anxious on a schedule. Rome was excellent at anxiety on a schedule. It had calendars. It had omens. It had rituals. It could make fear feel organized, which is a terrifying form of comfort. Then there was the court, where every illness could become a political headline quietly, of course, because Rome didn't have headlines. It had murmurs. Succession made even natural death look convenient, and convenience is always suspicious when money and power are involved. A court was full of tasters, doctors, servants, rivals, relatives, and people who are all free at once depending on the day. Too many hands around a single meal. Too many reasons to interpret a cough as a plot. In that environment, a poison economy could thrive even if most poisonings were imagined because paranoia pays well. The empire didn't need constant actual poisonings to fear them. It only needed a few believable ones and a steady supply of rumors to keep everyone sipping carefully. And now, gently, we drift to the part that is almost domestic. Because the end result of a culture that believes poison is everywhere is not constant screaming. It's procedure. Daily life becomes a set of small rules. Who pours, who tastes, who touches the cup, who stands close to the kitchen, who is allowed to stir the pot, who is allowed to buy herbs without being watched. Trust narrows. Kitchens become political spaces. Even honest medicine starts to look suspicious, because the line between cure and harm is often not the ingredient itself, but the amount and the story told about it afterward. If you've ever read a modern label and felt personally judged by the phrase, "do not exceed recommended dosage," you already understand the vibe. Rome also lived with that gentle menace of substances, just without the neat typography. People learned to watch, to make routines out of caution, to manage fear through repetition. A household might create its own small rituals: taste first, pour second, serve third, watch everyone's hands, pretend you're relaxed. And the funny thing is that routines can make anyone feel safer, even when they're built around invisible threats. It's the most human habit. We can't control everything, so we control the spoon. And the spoon really matters in this story, not because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary. A bronze spoon is the kind of object that outlives arguments. It taps glass, it stirs honey, it dissolves something bitter into something sweet, and makes it seem like a reasonable compromise. The bottle matters for the same reason. A bottle looks innocent. It sits on a shelf. It catches light. It can hold perfume, medicine, oil, wine, or a private decision someone refuses to name. Rome was a world of bottles, and once you notice that, it becomes hard to unnotice, like suddenly becoming aware of how many keys you carry. So keep the story in one jar bottles, herbs, spurs, middle hands, and keep the lesson in another, how fear turns ordinary systems into dark myths. If you want to end softly, imagine a small shop at dusk, jars labeled in careful script, the smell of resin and wine and clean water nearby. Someone comes in for sleep. Someone comes in for pain. Someone comes in for love, which is always a slightly suspicious request in any century. Someone comes in for revenge they won't say out loud, because even in Rome, people sometimes disliked admitting their hobbies. The shutters close. The fountain keeps running. A cork turns again, patiently, like it has done 1,000 times. A spoon taps glass once, then stops, satisfied. And the bottle, innocent or not, disappears into a sleeve, into a basket, into a pocket, into the normal movement of the city. And Rome keeps doing what it does best at night, sounding steady, sounding ordinary, sounding like it could go on for a very long time, until your thoughts loosen their grip and drift quietly somewhere else. A small brass lever clicks, not dramatically, just the way metal clicks when it has clicked 10,000 times before. A rubber seal gives a quiet little sigh. Somewhere, behind a wall you can't see, air moves through a tube as if air has errands. And for a moment, it's oddly comforting to imagine a message traveling without anyone having to walk it there, like a thought being gently pushed along by nothing more than pressure and patience. Whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Tonight's history is the kind that feels like it was invented by someone who loved paperwork, disliked stairs, and wanted to win arguments with physics. We're going to drift through the sleepy, mildly absurd world of pneumatic mail, those underground tube systems that once carried little canisters of letters, and telegram slips through big cities, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's a story with almost no heroes, no villains, and very little emotional payoff, which is ideal. It's mostly about cylinders, schedules, and the strange confidence people get when they can send a piece of paper faster than a human can jog while holding it politely. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. A pneumatic tube would carry your decision either way, neatly sealed in a canister, and no one would clap. That's the elegance of the whole thing. Quiet effort, quiet delivery, quiet indifference from the universe. In the busiest parts of industrial cities, the problem wasn't that people couldn't communicate. They absolutely could. They could write letters, send messengers, shout from windows, or simply glare meaningfully at the next building. The problem was that cities became complicated. Offices multiplied. Banks had branches. Newspapers needed updates that were fresh, which in a city means not already old by lunchtime. And the more paper a society produces, the more it starts treating paper like a living creature that must be fed, exercised, and moved from room to room before it gets cranky. So someone looked at a crowded street and thought, What if we stop putting messages on legs? What if we put them in a tube instead? It's the same impulse that later gives you elevators, conveyor belts, and the little moving walkway at airports that makes everyone feel like a futuristic shopping cart. The pneumatic tube idea is basically a moving walkway for letters, except the letters are sealed in a capsule, and the walkway is underground and the letter never gets to look around, which is a shame because cities are interesting, but the letters never complained. They were busy being urgent. The urgency here is also a bit funny because many of these messages were the historical equivalent of "call me when you're free," or "send the numbers again," or "please confirm the meeting is still happening," except written on paper and delivered with the seriousness of a cannon. It's comforting, actually, to realize that human beings have always been desperate to transmit small anxieties. We just keep changing the container. A wax seal becomes an envelope. An envelope becomes a telegram form. A telegram form becomes a text message. The anxiety remains lovingly intact. And these tube systems didn't feel like science fiction at the time, not really. They felt like plumbing for information. They used air pressure, sometimes suction, sometimes compressed air, to push or pull canisters through pipes. The canister was often padded or sealed, so it wouldn't scrape itself into sadness along the way. It would arrive with a soft thump, like a very obedient fruit hitting the bottom of a basket. Someone would open it, remove the paper, and pretend they hadn't been waiting. That last part is important. Humans like pretending they're calm, even when they're checking the same clock every 30 seconds. If you wanted to find pneumatic mail in the wild, you didn't find it in a glamorous laboratory. You found it in the back rooms of post offices, the basements of telegraph buildings, inside big financial districts where time was treated like a fragile glass you must not spill. You found it near places where paper moved constantly, trading floors, government offices, newspaper rooms with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. The tube entrances were often unromantic, a station with a slot, a latch, a little door you open, and close with the same care you use for a refrigerator you don't fully trust. And the network itself was very politely invisible. It ran under streets like a second city made of pipes, carrying messages the way sewers carry water except cleaner, and with more gossip. Sometimes the tube lines connected specific buildings. Sometimes they connected whole districts. They were not always vast empires of tubes. Often they were practical little loops built to solve one narrow problem. It takes too long to walk this from here to there, and I don't want to pay another. Messenger. History is full of inventions that begin with mild impatience and a budget. There's also something soothing about how mechanical it all was. No wireless signals. No glowing screens. Just air, pressure, friction, and the stubborn decision to make paper move faster. You can almost hear the system thinking, not loudly, just a quiet, determined whoosh thunk. Next. If your mind likes repetitive sounds, it's basically a lullaby for bureaucrats. Of course, the system didn't run itself. This is where the truly sleepy characters arrive. Clerks, operators, and maintenance workers whose lives were shaped by levers and labels. Someone had to load the canisters. Someone had to make sure the right canister went to the right place, which is harder than it sounds when you remember that human beings can misplace anything, including their own thoughts. And someone had to keep the tubes clean, because even an elegant system becomes less elegant when it's full of dust, moisture, or that one mysterious crumb that appears in every building everywhere. Imagine the daily rhythm. A clerk writes a message, folds it, maybe stamps it, maybe ties it with a small string because humans love adding extra steps when they're nervous. The clerk slides it into a capsule. The capsule is closed, sometimes with a satisfying seal that suggests competence. The capsule is placed into a tube station. A lever is pulled. Air does the rest. A moment later, perhaps a short moment, perhaps long enough to sip tea and pretend you're not watching, the capsule arrives somewhere else. Another clerk retrieves it, opens it, reads the message, and experiences the timeless human emotion of, oh, that's what they meant? Followed by, why didn't they just say that? The people who truly made this work were the middle hands. The ones who didn't write the message and didn't receive the message, but carried it into the system, out of the system, logged it, routed it, corrected it when it went wrong. They were like human adapters between paper and air. And as always, when you build a system that moves fast, you create new jobs devoted to managing the speed. Because speed is not free. It costs attention. It costs routine. It costs us someone standing there, ready to catch the canister like a sleepy game of fetch. And yes, things went wrong, because history loves a small malfunction more than a grand design. Canisters could be misrouted. They could get delayed. They could arrive with a slightly offended thud. A capsule might be sent to the wrong office because someone's handwriting was too artistic, or because two addresses looked similar, or because everyone was tired and the tube station labels were not as clear as they thought. It's strangely modern. Replace tube station with email thread, and you can feel the continuity in your bones. There were also etiquette questions, which is my favorite kind of historical detail because it's both pointless and deeply revealing. How many messages were you allowed to send in a row before you became that person? How much could you stuff into a capsule before it became a slow-moving sausage of paperwork? Whether it was rude to mark something urgent when it was only emotionally urgent. Whether the system should prioritize official mail over private messages. Humans will always invent a hierarchy the moment you give them a cue. And because the system looked so clean and scientific, people sometimes trusted it more than they trusted humans. That is a very relatable mistake. A tube network feels impartial. It doesn't gossip. It doesn't judge your spelling. It doesn't roll its eyes. It just moves things. But the network was still operated by people, and people bring their gentle chaos with them like a personal perfume. Underneath the quiet romance of tubes and canisters, there was a world of measurements. Tube diameters mattered. Capsule sizes mattered. The fit had to be snug enough to move smoothly, but not so tight that everything became a wheezing tragedy. Pressure levels had to be watched. Seals had to be checked. If air leaked, the system got tired, and a tired pneumatic system is like a tired person. It still works, but it sighs a lot and takes longer to do simple things. Maintenance logs existed, and I love that. Somewhere someone wrote down the facts of air. Checked valve, replaced seal. Cleared obstruction. It's the kind of writing that never becomes literature, but it becomes history anyway, because it's evidence that a system lived. A historian finds those records and realizes this city once had a hidden heartbeat made of air pressure and paper. Some systems worked alongside telegraph offices, which is a funny layering of technology. You could have a message turned into electrical pulses, then printed back into paper, then shoved into a capsule, then pushed through a tube, then handed to a person. It's like sending an email, printing it, putting it in an envelope, and mailing it to someone who will scan it and upload it back into the cloud. Humans love circles. Circles make us feel busy, and once you have a system that touches money, government, or headlines, you also get regulation, debates, and the soft drama of meetings about infrastructure. Should the city expand the tube network? Should private companies run it? Should the post office control it? Should it be taxed? Should it be standardized? Should it be politely ignored because it's expensive and slightly ridiculous? These are not the kinds of arguments that make epic poems, but they do make committees, and committees are basically the natural habitat of boredom. There were also patent disputes and technical rivalries, because if you invent a way to push paper through a pipe, someone else will invent a slightly different way to push paper through a pipe and insist it is morally superior. One person prefers suction, another prefers compressed air. A third insists the capsule lining should be changed, because the current lining makes an unflattering sound upon arrival. The fourth person, quietly, is just trying to keep the whole thing from clogging, because history often belongs to the people who unclog. And while all this was happening, ordinary life kept flowing above ground. People walked, horses pulled carts. Later, cars appeared and made everything smell different. Newspapers sold the day's worries. Someone somewhere argued about whether the city was becoming too modern, which is a sentence that works in almost any decade if you say it with a sigh. Eventually, the tube systems began to fade, not with a dramatic collapse, but with the slow, gentle replacement that happens when a newer technology becomes cheaper and easier. Telephones reduced the need for certain kinds of written messages. Then new systems arrived, and then newer systems arrived, and the tubes became slightly less essential. Some survived in limited forms, some were repurposed, some were sealed up and forgotten, which is a very peaceful ending for a piece of infrastructure. Imagine being a tube and finally getting to rest. And the afterlife of these networks is one of the most bedtime-friendly things imaginable. Quiet remnants in basements, old tube stations turned into storage, pipes that still run under streets even though no one uses them, like a hidden hallway in a house that everyone forgot existed. Museums sometimes display capsules which look like small metal loaves of bread, the kind you'd never want to eat, but you'd trust to carry a message. If you think about it gently, pneumatic mail is a story about how much effort people will spend to avoid walking, and also about how much effort people will spend to feel in control of time. A city is always trying to fold distance into something manageable. If you can move paper quickly, you feel like you're holding the day by the collar. Even if the paper just says, send more paper, and now. As we drift toward the soft end, you can imagine a small office late in the afternoon. Light fading, dust in the air. A clerk with tired hands slides one last note into a capsule. It's not a grand message. It's not a confession. It's something practical, like a number, a request, a confirmation, a reminder that someone somewhere needs a signature. The capsule clicks shut. The lever is pulled. The air does its quiet work. Somewhere else, another clerk hears the gentle arrival. That soft thump that says, something has traveled, something has moved without walking, something has been delivered by invisible pressure. The capsule is opened, the paper is removed. The message is read. Nothing dramatic happens. No one gasps. No one changes their destiny. The day simply continues, slightly more organized, slightly more tired. And if you want to end softly, you can let your mind follow the capsule instead of the message. Imagine it gliding through darkness, turning through a curve, passing through a junction, never seeing the city, never caring about the city, just moving because it was designed to move. A calm little cylinder, pushed along by air, like a thought being gently carried forward. The fountain outside keeps running. The lever rests. The tube waits for the next capsule that may never come, and the city above keeps making its ordinary noise, while the quiet underground network, half remembered, half forgotten, holds still, as if it could wake up again at any moment, but doesn't need to, and you don't need to either. You can just let the air move somewhere else now, and let your attention drift, slowly, the way paper once drifted through tubes, without urgency, without plot, and without anyone needing to clap at the end. A cork twists somewhere in the dark, not with drama, just with that small patient squeak that says the bottle has been opened before and will be opened again. A brown spoon taps glass once, as if it's checking whether the world is still solid. Outside, a street fountain runs without looking up, doing what fountains do best, moving water in circles while everyone else invents new problems. Whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It's a little strange, if you think about it softly, how often ancient Rome tried to solve life's loud uncertainties with quiet little liquids. A fever arrives, a stomach turns. A strong man suddenly looks weak. A rich man suddenly looks inconvenient. And the mind, always hungry for tidy explanations, starts looking for something you can hold in your hand. A cup, a jar, a pinch of powder, a drop that doesn't announce itself. In Rome, danger wasn't always a knife in an alley. Sometimes it was a feeling, the sort of feeling that can be blamed on anything, which is exactly what makes it useful to worry about. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where Romans argue about whether rumor counts as evidence, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The ancient world will keep turning either way, and it will not send you a notification. It will simply keep offering humans the same choices over and over in slightly different sandals. The first sleepy truth about Rome, a so-called poison economy, is that it eyes us in one neat category. It's overlap. It's the same ingredients living multiple lives. A plant can be medicine in one hand, perfume in another, pest control in a third, and a scandal in the fourth. A salve that helps your skin could also be the thing your neighbor whispers about when someone's uncle stops breathing in an entirely unhelpful way. And because so many symptoms look like ordinary illness because bodies are complicated and dramatic and private people could pay for solutions that were impossible to prove after the fact, that's what makes the whole thing so calmly unsettling. It's less about secret assassins and more about ambiguity having a price tag. Romans lived with a constant background noise of sickness. Not just plagues in the big, famous sense, but the daily, ordinary kind. Bad water, bad food, too much wine, not enough sleep. An infection that starts as a small annoyance and becomes a household event. In that world, a poison isn't automatically evil. It's a word people use when they want the story to have a villain, and villains are comforting. Villains make the universe feel organized. If the problem is a villain, then the solution is, theoretically, to find them, point at them, and stop them. It's a very soothing fantasy. Rome loved fantasies that could be written down. And the market for quiet solutions wasn't a shadowy alley with a hooded figure. It was very often just shopping. That's the part that feels almost modern in the most boring way. You find herbs and resins and oils through the same channels people use for a perfectly normal life. There were herbalists and sellers of remedies, perfumers who dealt in scents and sticky substances, household suppliers with jars lined up like obedient soldiers. Midwives and healers handled plants and compounds because their work sat close to birth, pain, sleep, and the many private problems people don't like saying out loud in public. The ingredients could be ordinary. The intention could be vague. And vagueness in this economy is the product. A small shop at the edge of a market might sell dried roots, powdered bark, and oils that promise calm, strength, appetite, romance, or whatever else people wanted to feel in control of. The labels could be simple, or poetic, or suspiciously confident. Some items might be imported, which adds the gentle thrill of distance. Humans have always trusted faraway things more than nearby things, as if a jar becomes wiser after traveling. And the funniest part is that a network can hide in plain sight because it looks like routine. It looks like a woman buying something for her husband's cough. It looks like a servant picking up a remedy for a child's stomach. It looks like a rich man buying scented oil because he would like to smell less like stress. The people who made it work were rarely the ones who needed the substance. They were the middle hands, the fixers, the whisperers, the friend of a friend, the person who can walk between households without being noticed because they've always been there. Servants moved through private spaces like shadows with jobs. Free people ran errands and carried messages. They heard arguments through doors and learned secrets the way walls learn them by standing nearby long enough. If someone wanted a solution, they often didn't say the word poison. They said something softer, something that could mean sleep, or calm, or fertility, or a rival's health, which is a very Roman way of sounding polite while leaving the meaning safely blurry. And blur protects everyone. The buyer can claim innocence. The seller can claim they sold medicine. The messenger can claim they delivered a package without asking questions, which is technically true and emotionally convenient. In a city full of status and danger, ambiguity isn't just a side effect. It's a skill. Rome had many skills, and most of them were paperwork. Of course, once you have rumors, you also have stereotypes. Rome attached poison stories to women with almost comical consistency, as if fear needed a familiar costume. Women, especially outsiders, poor women, women with medical knowledge, these were easy characters for suspicion to dress up as. Midwives and healers could be respected in private and distrusted in public, because people love help until help becomes powerful. And power in Rome always made someone nervous. If a powerful man died suddenly, rumors searched for a convenient hand to blame, and poison was a story people already knew how to tell. It's also worth noting, sleepily, that Roman gossip didn't need facts to be efficient. It needed timing. It needed a few believable details. A strange taste in wine, a servant seen near a cup, a rival who smiled at the wrong moment. The city ran on conversations as much as it ran on aqueducts, and conversations are cheaper than investigations. They require no tools, only voices. Then come the laws, because Rome loved turning anxiety into official language. There were legal categories for poisoners and beneficia, a word that could drift between poisoning and magic, depending on who was speaking and how dramatic they wanted to sound. There were statutes that tried to draw a firm line around something that was, by nature, slippery. The problem of proof is the heart of this whole sleepy machine. How do you prove poison when poison can look like illness, and illness is everywhere? How do you measure a whisper? How do you weigh a rumor? So accusations often leaned on motives in social theater. Who benefits? Who hated whom? Who was present? Who had access to the meal? Trials could become performances where reputations did most of the work, because reputations are easier to display than evidence. Witnesses speak, enemies testify. A person's past becomes a pile of stories, and the court decides which stories feel true enough to punish. And sometimes, this is the quietly absurd part, the trial itself becomes the weapon. If you can accuse someone of poison, you can damage them even if no poison existed. It's like throwing ink on a white toga. The stain is the point. Now drift this into the imperial world, where paranoia had a budget. In the orbit of emperors in succession, every illness could become a political event. Natural death was inconvenient because it didn't provide someone to blame. Rome preferred narratives where causes had faces. At court, too many hands hovered near a single meal. Tasters existed not because they were glamorous, but because anxiety likes rituals. Doctors, servants, rivals, relatives, everyone has a reason to be near the body, and being near the body makes you suspicious by association. In that environment, the poison economy thrives even if most murders are imagined, because imagination is enough to sell fear. And fear changes behavior in very procedural ways, which is wonderfully boring. Households begin to manage daily life like a checklist. Who pours? Who tastes? Who touches the cup? Trust narrows into routines. Kitchens become political spaces, not because anyone wants them to be, but because food is intimate. And intimacy makes people nervous when power is involved. Even honest medicine starts looking suspicious because the line between cure and harm can be framed as dosage and intent is famously hard to bottle. The result is a Rome that feels modern in the worst way, anxiety managed through routine. You can almost see it happening at a dinner table. The host smiles, the guests smile back. The wine is poured in a careful order that looks like hospitality but also looks like control. Someone makes a joke that isn't funny, and everyone laughs anyway, because laughter is another ritual. A servant stands very still because stillness is safety. And all of this can happen without any poison at all. Sometimes the real product is the suspicion. Suspicion is portable, renewable, and it never expires. If you listen closely, the whole system is less a network of secret killers and more a network of stories. Stories about women who know too much, stories about outsiders, stories about servants, stories about ambition, stories about fragile bodies. Rome traded in those stories the way it traded in grain and oil, except stories travel faster and don't need ships. And now, to end softly, you can keep the facts in one jar bottles, herbs, whispers, laws, and the strange comfort of procedures, and keep the human feeling in another jar, sealed loosely so it can breathe. Imagine a small shop at dusk, not a villain's den, just a place with shelves and labels written in careful script. The air smells faintly of resin and wine and something floral that tries very hard to seem innocent. A customer arrives for sleep, another for pain, another for love, and another for a kind of revenge they won't name aloud because naming makes it real. The seller nods, weighs something, wraps it, and says very little, because silence is good business. Outside, the fountain keeps running, indifferent and steady. Inside, the shutters close with that gentle final sound of wood meeting wood. Somewhere, a household counts its routines like beads, hoping order can keep fear out of the room. And somewhere else, a rumor slides from one person to another, light as breath, heavy as consequence, the kind of message that doesn't need a bottle at all. If the story feels too awake, let it become small again. A spoon, a cup, a label, a cautious hand. A quiet city that is always trying to control what can't be controlled. And as you rest, you can let the jars stay on the shelf. The whispers stay in the air and the fountain keep running because it doesn't have to solve anything. It only has to run. And you only have to drift slowly as if a night could go on listing ordinary details forever without ever demanding a conclusion. A small bell rings somewhere that isn't trying to be dramatic about it. Just one tidy note. A wooden ruler slides across a table with the slow patience of a thing that has been sliding across tables for centuries. A quill scratches paper, pauses, and scratches again, as if it forgot what century it was in for a moment. And somewhere nearby, water makes that gentle, repetitive sound it makes in old cities, like the world is rinsing a single stone over and over, not because it's necessary, but because it's comforting. Whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Tonight's quiet little historical subject is the Venetian Republic's obsession with measurement, specifically the sleepy, stubborn work of standardizing things like oar lengths and rope lots in and around the arsenal. Not the glamorous Venice of mass balls and paintings, but the Venice of rulers, stamps, inventory lists, and the kind of careful agreement that makes an empire run without anyone having to raise their voice. You might not expect a city built on water to have so many strong feelings about the exact length of a piece of wood, but it did. And if that feels oddly specific, good. That's exactly the right kind of specific for bedtime. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where a clerk has to count bundles of hemp like they precious gemstones, you can subscribe. Or you can just keep breathing and let the thought drift away. Venice won't know either way. Venice is busy measuring. In a place like the arsenal, the most important tool is not a sword. It's a standard. A standard is a quietly powerful idea. It is the promise that when two different people make the same thing in two different corners of a complex, they will still make something that fits. It's an invisible handshake between strangers who never meet. And for something as simple and as oddly intimate as an or something that will be held by hands, pushed through water, leaned against shoulders, Venice wanted consistency. Not because consistency is beautiful, though it can be, but because inconsistency is annoying. And annoyance, in a busy republic, becomes expensive. So imagine a long wooden measuring stick, worn smooth where generations of fingers have touched it. Imagine it lying on a bench like a quiet judge. An ore blank comes in fresh wood, rough edges, the smell of cut timber still hanging around it. Someone checks length, someone checks thickness. Someone checks the shape where the blade widens, because the blade is where the water listens to the ore, and Venice wanted the water to listen the same way every time. It's the kind of attention that feels almost tender until you remember it's also bureaucratic. The amusing part is that this isn't really about ores. It's about trust. Venice was a city that trusted systems more than it trusted moods. A system can be written down. A mood can't. A system can be audited. A mood cannot be politely stamped in red ink and filed. When you standardize an ore, you reduce the number of surprises. And the Venetian state, like many states, preferred surprises in paintings, not in logistics. Now let your mind drift from the wood to the rope, because rope is where Venetian practicality becomes almost poetic. Rope is just twisted fiber, yes, but it's also restraint, connection, and safety. It's the thing that holds, the thing that ties, the thing that can be trusted until it can't. So Venice treated rope. The rope makers lived in a world of fiber quality and humidity. Hemp behaves differently when the air is damp. Rope swells. Rope stiffens. Rope gets moody. Which is rude, honestly, because rope is supposed to be dependable. So rope needed standards too. Not just good rope and bad rope, but rope measured by thickness, length, and intended purpose. Rope for lifting is not rope for tying. Rope for tying is not rope for decoration. Rope for decoration is, in some ways, the most suspicious rope of all, because it pretends to be useless while quietly proving that humans will tie things even when nothing needs tying. Somewhere in this world, a man is counting rope coils. You can picture him doing it with the same expression you would use to count socks after laundry mile determination. Faint resignation and the hope that the numbers will match the expected total so nobody has to have a conversation about it. Bundles of hemp arrive. They are weighed. They are recorded. They are stored. And each step is both deeply boring and extremely important, which is one of history's favorite combinations. Now, the next soft piece of the puzzle is the people who make this whole measuring world function. Not the famous leaders whose names end up on monuments, but the middle hands, foremen, inspectors, clerks, and workers with specialized skills so specific that you could spend your entire life becoming extremely good at one small, repetitive task. The arsenal had master shipwrights, yes, but it also had people whose job was essentially to notice if someone tried to pass off slightly substandard material as acceptable. It's not glamorous to notice, but notice people keep civilizations from wobbling. Think about the clerk. The clerk is always there, like a piece of furniture that can write. He has ink. He has ledgers. He has a neat little mental world where quantities matter. He writes down how many ores were produced, how many were rejected, how many were repaired, and how many were mysteriously missing, which is a category. Every era invents because humans are consistent in one way. They misplace things and then pretend the universe is responsible. The clerk also has a stamp or access to a stamp because states love stamps. Stamps are the state's way of saying, this object is now part of the official dream. A stamped item is no longer just an item. It's a certified item. And certification has always been the most soothing kind of magic that comes with paperwork. There are also the whisperers, but not in the romantic sense. The whisperers in this world are the people who know how things really work. The person who knows which supplier's hemp tends to arrive slightly damp. The person who knows that a certain batch of wood feels lighter than it should. The person who knows that if you store rope too close to a wall, it takes on the wall's moisture like a shy sponge. These are not grand secrets, they're tiny, practical secrets. And tiny, practical secrets are the ones that keep you from falling into the water at an inconvenient moment. And because Venice is Venice, there's always the faint presence of politics hovering over all of this like a well-dressed seagull. The Republic wanted control without chaos. It wanted to look calm, It wanted to be calm. So it built systems that could be checked. A foreman could be watched. A supplier could be reviewed. A ledger could be inspected. It is not that Venice was free of corruption. No human group has ever achieved that dreamy state. But Venice did prefer corruption that behaved politely, kept appointments, and did not disrupt the schedule. Now drift into the third gentle scene. The records, the inspections, the art of not being caught making something slightly wrong. Because once you have standards, you also have the eternal human temptation to cut corners in ways that seem small and harmless at the time, a fraction thinner, a knot tied a bit quickly, a measurement done by eye instead of by ruler. Eye measurement is the ancestor of close enough, and close enough has sunk many ships, metaphorically and otherwise. So inspection becomes a ritual. Someone checks the oars. Someone checks the rope. Someone checks the markings. Sometimes the markings are simple, a sign that the item came from a particular workshop or met a particular requirement. Sometimes it's more like an administrative tattoo. Either way, the mark is the object's passport. Without it, the object is just a piece of wood or fiber. With it, it becomes part of a system that can be trusted, blamed, replaced, and filed. The ledger world is also quietly dramatic in its own slow way. Each line is a tiny claim about reality. Received 20 bundles, issued 10 coils, rejected 3 ores. It's like a slow chant. And because Venice was a trading power, it understood that if you can write something down, you can manage it from far away. Paper extends control. Ink extends authority. And if you've ever tried to remember anything without writing it down, you know why states love paper so much. Memory is soft, ink is stubborn. There's a sleepy irony here too, because the more detailed the system becomes, the more room there is for the system to become the story. A missing coil of rope becomes not just a missing coil of rope, but an incident, an investigation, a note in a margin, a conversation between 2 officials who would rather be somewhere else. It's possible that nothing dramatic happened at all. The rope might have been moved, or mislabeled, or counted twice. But once it's in the ledger as unaccounted, it gains a kind of bureaucratic gravity. It becomes heavier than rope should be. At this point, you might notice how much of history is people trying to make the physical world behave like a spreadsheet. Venice wanted the sea to behave like a system. It wanted wood to behave like a standard. It wanted rope to behave like a number. And sometimes it worked, which is almost funny because the sea is famously uninterested in behaving. Now let's slide gently into the 4th scene. What happens after the measurement? After the item is approved and used and then inevitably stops being perfect. Because nothing stays perfect, not even a well-measured ore. Wood wears down. Rope frays, knots loosen. Salt water is basically time in liquid form. So the arsenal's world is not just production, it's maintenance. It's repair. It's the slow acceptance that standards are ideals and reality is a little messy. There are people whose job is to fix, not to create. Repair work is the quiet cousin of creation. It's less praised, it's more practical, and it requires its own set of skills. Knowing how to replace a section without weakening the whole, knowing when to retire an item rather than stubbornly pretend it's still useful. This is another sleepy lesson of bureaucracy. At some point, you have to decide when something stops being worth the ink it takes to track it. In storage rooms, oars rest like tired limbs. Bundles of rope hang in loops, patient and slightly dusty, like the arsenal is a giant closet that never finishes being organized. And the soundscape remains the same. Footsteps, murmured numbers, the occasional tap of wood, the scratch of pen. If you've ever been in a place where people are doing routine work with focus, you know the feeling. It's not exciting. It's not meant to be. It's just steady. And steadiness, for sleep, is a gift. And in the background, Venice continues being Venice. Boats moving, water shining, a city built on engineering and agreement. It's easy to romanticize it, and Venice certainly enjoyed being romanticized. But under the romance is something quieter, a state that survived by making sure small things fit together. An oar that is the right length, a rope that holds, a ledger that balances, a stamp that says, yes, this is acceptable, which is one of the most powerful sentences ever invented. If you want to end softly, imagine a late afternoon in the arsenal. Light slips in through high windows and lands on a ruler, on a coil of rope, on a clerk's hand. Someone sets down a finished oar with a careful little thump, like placing a sleeping child into a bed that has been measured, of course, to the correct dimensions. Someone ties a knot and pulls it snug, testing it without suspicion, just habit. The day's numbers get written down because numbers like to be tucked in before night. Outside, the water keeps moving, unbothered by the accuracy of human systems. Inside, the systems keep humming, unbothered by the water's refusal to be predictable. And somewhere between those two stubborn forces, water and paperwork, Venice exists, not as a grand story with a climax, but as a long, repetitive practice of making things line up. A ruler on wood, a stamp on paper, a coil of rope hanging quietly in the dim. And if your mind wants to drift, it can drift with them, following the slow rhythm of measured life where nothing needs to resolve, and everything can simply continue calmly as if it has all the time in the world. There's a special kind of quiet that belongs to a courtroom that is trying to prove something invisible. Not the loud kind of courtroom from stories, with shouting and dramatic confessions, but the soft kind where everyone is mostly waiting for certainty to arrive, and it never quite does. In Rome, the trouble with poison was that it behaved like a rumor with symptoms. A fever arrives, a stomach turns, someone looks pale at dinner, says they're fine, and then they're not. And the moment the body stops speaking for itself, the city starts speaking for it. The first problem is that poison does not politely announce itself. It doesn't carry a little tag that says, "Hello, I am definitely poison. Please convict someone accordingly." Many natural illnesses look suspicious when you're already suspicious, which in imperial politics was basically always. A bad batch of food can imitate malice. A common infection can imitate a plot. Even grief can imitate guilt because people look strange when they're afraid. And fear has a way of making the innocent fidget like they've misplaced something important. If you've ever watched someone try to remember where they left their keys, you know the expression. Now imagine that expression being interpreted as treason. So proof becomes a performance. Not because everyone is lying necessarily, but because proof has to be made out of what is available. Who was near the cup? Who poured? Who tasted? Who had access? Who benefits? Who's disliked? Who has a reputation that's already halfway to a verdict? And in a world without modern tests, the line between evidence and narrative gets very thin, like a cheap cloth held up to the light. You can see shapes, but you can't always be sure what you're seeing. It's all shadows and confident voices. Witnesses matter, which is always a little funny, because witnesses are humans, and humans are not exactly famous for being accurate under pressure. Someone swears they saw a servant linger near the wine. Someone insists the victim made a face, as if faces are legally binding documents. Someone remembers hearing a whisper. Someone else remembers the whisper differently. And somewhere in the middle sits a clerk, trying to turn human memory into neat lines of text. Because that is what states do when confronted with chaos. They attempt to file it. And then there's the most drowsy, maddening detail of all. Sometimes the accusation is the weapon, even if the poison never existed. Poison is an easy story to attach to a death that feels unfair or inconvenient or politically useful. It explains too much with one word. It turns uncertainty into blame. It gives grief a direction, like pointing a finger so the mind can stop spinning. If you're a powerful person with rivals, poison is a shadow that follows you everywhere, quietly, like a household cat that keeps appearing in doorways. It doesn't need to do anything to change the room. It just needs to be there, so the poison economy isn't only about ingredients in jars. It's also about the economy of proof itself, how a society buys and sells certainty when certainty is scarce. A single illness can become a courtroom's entire season of entertainment, a rumor's entire career, and a family's entire private disaster, all without a single identifiable drop of anything. And if you let that thought drift, gently, it becomes almost boring in its repetition. A cup, a dinner, a sudden weakness, a string of names, and a city trying to measure something it cannot see, using only voices, gestures, and the soft, tired desire for an answer that fits neatly on the page. You might not expect a country to accidentally invent a day that almost no one else has ever used, and then politely place it inside a month like a spare button in a drawer. But that is exactly the kind of quiet nonsense history is capable of. Somewhere in Sweden, in the early 18th century, a calendar quietly developed an extra wrinkle, the way a bedsheet does when you don't shake it out fully. And if your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be calm. Let your thoughts loosen their grip. We're going to talk about dates and numbers, and the strange human need to make time behave, even though time, as you know, is not especially interested in being managed. Calendars are basically paperwork for the sky. The sun does what it does, the moon does what it does, and people stand underneath with ink and determination, trying to turn drifting light into clean columns. The idea is simple. You want spring to arrive roughly when your calendar says it should, because that's when you plant things and stop pretending winter is a personality. But the true length of a year is not a neat number of days, and that small mismatch is the kind of tiny inconvenience that, over centuries, becomes a full-scale clerical hobby. So humans add leap days, subtract them, argue about them, and then act surprised when the arguments last longer than the average dynasty. For a long time, much of Europe used the Julian calendar, which was a solid attempt and also slightly wrong in a slow, patient way. The year it assumed was a little too long by minutes. Not exciting minutes, just the kind of minutes you lose when you scroll too long or stare into the fridge expecting new options. Those minutes piled up anyway, quietly, until the dates drifted away from the seasons. Eventually, the Gregorian calendar arrived like a stern librarian, adjusting the rules so Easter wouldn't wander off like a distracted sheep. Some places adopted it quickly, others took their time, and Sweden, as it turns out, tried to take its time in a very particular, very Swedish way. Carefully, gradually, and then, because history loves a gentle stumble imperfectly, Sweden's plan was almost adorable in its optimism. Instead of doing the big, dramatic thing and dropping a bunch of days all at once, Sweden decided to slide into the new calendar slowly by skipping leap days over a period of years. Imagine trying to move your bed across the room by pushing it 1 millimeter every day, so you don't have to lift anything. It sounds calm. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like it will definitely work as long as everyone remembers to keep pushing. The idea was that by not adding leap days in certain years, Sweden would gradually catch up with the Gregorian calendar without ever having to wake anyone up with a sudden day jump. Gentle calendar therapy. Very soothing. Very dependent on the entire bureaucracy doing the exact right thing for decades, which is historically an ambitious request, and then the plan met real life, which is a reliable place for plans to go slightly soft at the edges. Leap days were skipped in 1700, so Sweden took its first step into this slow motion adjustment. And then, In the following years, when leap days should also have been skipped under the plan, they were not. Which means the calendar experiment didn't continue so much as it paused, forgot what it was doing, and wandered into the kitchen for a snack. This left Sweden in an awkward, sleepy middle state, not fully Julian, not fully Gregorian, but 1 day off from one and 2 days off from the other, like a person who has set their clocks differently in every room for convenience and now lives in quiet confusion. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where a government tries to fix a calendar by adding a day that doesn't exist anywhere else, you can subscribe or don't. It's fine. The calendar will continue either way. It always does. Meanwhile, imagine being a clerk in this era, sitting at a desk with a quill, writing dates like they're facts. The ink scratches forward. The paper holds still. You write February and you feel confident because February is a real month. Then you write 29 and you feel fairly confident because leap days are a known nuisance. But imagine the sensation of being asked to write a date that sounds like a typo. Something like February 30th. Your hand would hover. Your face would do that subtle expression of polite doubt. You would probably check a second source, then a third, and then you would realize that, yes, the country has decided that time needs a small correction, and you personally are going to be the one who writes it down. So Sweden, having started a gradual reform and then not quite continuing it, decided to undo the confusion by returning to the Julian calendar. And the way you return to Julian, if you've drifted 1 day away from it, is by adding a day back in. This is the part where time gets handled like a ledger. 1 day is missing from the books, so the solution is not poetry or philosophy or a ceremonial apology to the sky. The solution is to put the day back, and the place they put it in 1712 was February. Not even a playful month, just February, the short month. The month that already feels like it's always arriving slightly unfinished. They gave it an extra day, but instead of calling it the leap day, they essentially created February 30th, one of the rarest dates in the modern imagination. Like a mythical animal that turns out to be briefly real. Now, to be clear, this did not mean everyone in Sweden threw a party for February 30th. It was not an international holiday. It was not a new season. It was, in many places, probably experienced as a normal day with an extra layer of administrative awkwardness. People still ate. People still worked. Someone probably complained about the weather because that is what humans do when handed time. But in the paperwork, that date existed. In church records, in legal documents, in the quiet corners where history keeps its receipts. Somewhere, someone signed something on February 30th and then, later in life, may have wondered if anyone would believe them. It's a strange thought. You can be perfectly honest and still sound like you're making things up, simply because your calendar has a brief personality crisis. And the funniest part, funny in the way a paper jam is funny after you fixed it, is that calendars are meant to remove confusion, not create it. Their job is to keep everyone on the same page, literally. But when calendars shift, the confusion spreads through ordinary life in tiny ways. If you're paid on a certain day, which day is it exactly if a day has been added? If you're tracking rent or interest or the number of days a ship has been at sea, you suddenly need to decide whether this invented date counts. For most people, the answer is probably yes, because the day happened, and you don't get to skip work just because the date feels suspicious. Time may be messy, but bills tend to be punctual. It also makes you think about birthdays. Somewhere there may have been a child born on February 30th, 1712. It's not impossible. Babies do not consult calendars. They arrive when they arrive, and humans scramble to label the moment. If someone was born on that date, how did they explain it later? Did they celebrate on February 28th in non-leap years like a person born on February 29th would? Did they pick March 1st for convenience? Or did they quietly become the kind of person who avoids birthdays entirely? Not out of sadness, but out of sheer conversational fatigue. Yes, they would say, it's February 30th. And then they would watch the other person's face try to decide whether to laugh. It's a small, sleepy example of how systems designed for clarity can create an odd little pocket of mystery dot eventually. Sweden did adopt the Gregorian calendar properly, later in the 18th century, and that involved a more familiar correction skipping days to align with the rest of Europe. By then, February 30th was already a strange one-off, a single extra stepping stone in a river that people prefer to pretend is smooth. And that's the gentle lesson here. Timekeeping is not just astronomy. It's administration. It's agreement. It's a society deciding to live inside the same grid. When the grid changes, reality doesn't change, but the labels do. And humans can become very emotional about labels, even when they insist they aren't dot. So if you let this story settle into the soft part of your mind, it becomes less about Sweden and more about the quiet, endless work of making the world legible. People in small rooms writing down what day it is. People in larger rooms deciding what day it should be. The sky continuing in its patient rhythm, entirely unbothered. And you hear, in whatever hour you're listening, letting the idea of a rare date drift past like a slow cloud. February 30th, sitting there in history like an extra page in a book. Not a twist, not a climax. Just a calm reminder that even time, when handled by humans, can occasionally develop an unnecessary detail and then just as quietly move on. You might not expect an empire to run, in part, on the quiet confidence of small jars, but Rome did have a talent for turning ordinary containers into social events. A cork twists somewhere in the dark. A brown spoon taps glass, not because anyone is being dramatic, but because people like to test the world with tiny sounds. A street fountain runs without looking up, which is the fountain's main skill. And if you're listening in a room that's already calm, you can let it stay that way. Just listen for a moment and notice how quickly your mind accepts the idea that a bottle can be important, even when it contains something as boring as oil, or as suspicious as anything labeled tonic. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer out loud. It's more of a soft check-in, like a scribe pausing before writing the date, making sure the ink is still willing to behave. Because Rome, for all its marble and slogans, was also a city of paperwork in motion, receipts, notes, quick promises, little lists that said who owed whom and for what. The poison economy, if we're going to use that slightly theatrical phrase, didn't live in a dungeon. It lived in the everyday places where people bought things they didn't want to explain, and where the seller didn't ask too many questions, partly out of professionalism, and partly because curiosity is a hobby that can shorten your career dot in Rome. Danger often arrived dressed as inconvenience. Not a villain in a cloak, not a lightning bolt, but a fever that won't take a hint. A stomach that turns at the wrong time. A weakness that looks like bad luck. That ambiguity creates a kind of market, because if symptoms can be explained as the gods were moody or the fish was questionable, then you can pay for something that leaves very little evidence. And in a world where medicine is half plant, half prayer, and half try this and see, the line between cure and harm is less of a line and more of a sleepy smudge. A substance can be a cosmetic in the morning, a pest control trick at noon, and a whispered solution at dusk, simply because the same ingredients can do several jobs. Depending on who is asking and how politely they ask, if you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The Romans would have understood that. They respected effort, but they also respected a well-timed nap, especially if someone else was doing the work. And this is, in a way, work, following the soft logic of how a city supplies itself with things it can't openly advertise. The first secret is that nothing looks like a secret when it's sitting among normal goods. A jar of honey is a jar of honey. A bottle of wine is a bottle of wine. A small packet of dried root is officially just a packet of dried root. When a network can hide inside shopping, it becomes nearly invisible because everyone is shopping all the time. So where would you actually find the ingredients for quiet solutions in Rome? Not in a dramatic back alley where a man with a scar says, "I have what you need." It's much more likely you'd find it in the places that feel annoyingly regular. In markets where herbs are sold for coughs and digestion and the general human fear of feeling slightly unwell. In perfume stalls, because fragrance is chemistry wearing a nicer outfit. In kitchens, where oils and wines can carry whatever is stirred into them without changing their basic personality. In the hands of midwives and healers, who touch the most private parts of life and therefore become targets for public suspicion whenever something goes wrong. It's almost unfair how predictable it is when people feel powerless. They look for a person to blame, and a person who handles plants and secrets is a very convenient shape for fear to sit on. The weirdly modern part is the supply chain feeling. You can imagine a list, just a small one of items to pick up. Resin, a certain leaf, a powder with an annoying name, maybe something that smells like a damp cupboard. Not because it's evil, necessarily, but because it's effective, which is what people really mean when they whisper. A basket passes from hand to hand. Coins clink softly, like everyone is trying not to wake the household. And the seller, who might be an herbalist, or a perfumer, or simply a person who knows how to keep their face neutral, does what sellers do best. They act like this is normal because in a market, everything is normal if it has a price. Then you get to the people who made it work, which is less about chemistry and more about the art of not standing too close to your own transaction. A seller rarely meets a client directly because directness is an emotional luxury and also a legal risk. Instead, things move through middle hands. A friend of a friend asks, using careful words that could mean several things. A servant carries a message because servants carry everything, including information, and often without being noticed. A freed person hears something in one household and repeats it in another, not out of malice, but because gossip is one of the city's main transportation systems. And what's being traded sometimes is not the substance itself, but the vagueness around it. Vagueness is a product. It protects buyer, seller, and messenger at the same time, like a shared blanket pulled up to the chin. You could request a solution as if you're talking about sleep, or anxiety, or infertility, or a rival's health, said with that soft, polite tone that pretends concern. Rome loved euphemisms the way modern people love quick chats that last an hour. And euphemisms are soothing because they keep the mind from touching the sharp edges. If you never name the thing directly, it feels less real, which is perfect for a sleepy city that is always trying to keep its own nerves under control. The irony is that the calmer the language gets, the easier it becomes to do things without thinking too hard about what they mean. That is not a Roman flaw, by the way. That is a human feature. Rome just had good documentation for it, and then, inevitably, you arrive at the social story Rome told itself about poison, which often attached itself to women, especially women who were already outside the safest circles, poor women, foreign women, women with medical knowledge, women who moved between private rooms and therefore became suspicious by default. Midwives could be respected in private and feared in public. Healers could be invited into a house to help and then blamed later because blame always wants a name and a face. If a powerful man died suddenly, rumor would start doing its little job through the city, looking for the nearest convenient explanation. Poison is a story people already know how to tell, which is why it travels so quickly. It saves everyone from having to accept the boring truth that bodies sometimes fail for reasons that don't involve enemies. Is where the poison economy becomes less about bottles and more about reputation. Reputation is a currency that never stops circulating. A woman can become famous as a healer and then infamous as a poisoner, sometimes without changing anything she actually does. A household can become paranoid and start watching who pours, who tastes, who carries the cup, as if a cup is a throne and the kitchen is a Senate meeting. And the more people watch, the more suspicious everything feels, because surveillance has a way of turning ordinary life into a performance. Even now, you can feel it. When you're being watched, you don't just do a task, you demonstrate doing the task. Rome turned that into a lifestyle dot at some point. Law arrives, because law is what a society uses to pretend it is in control of its own anxieties. Rome could punish poisoners, in theory, but proving poison is hard when symptoms mimic disease and bodies are buried quickly. There were no neat tests. There was no little strip you could dip into the cup and then sigh with relief because the line did not appear. Instead, accusations leaned on motives and gossip and who was present at the meal. Trials could become theatrical, not because Romans loved drama, though they did, but because uncertainty needs a stage. Witnesses speak, enemies testify, reputations collapse in public, and sometimes the trial is the point, using the accusation itself as a weapon. Even if no poison existed beyond the city's imagination, if you let your mind drift here, you can picture the courtroom as another kind of marketplace. Words are traded. Expressions are weighed. A pause becomes evidence. Someone says, "She handled the cup," and suddenly handling a cup sounds like handling a dagger. It's almost funny, in a quiet way, how easily ordinary actions become suspicious when they're placed inside a story people want to believe. Rome had many sophisticated systems, but it also had the timeless human habit of building certainty out of vibes. A man looks ill. The household looks nervous. Someone remembers a quarrel, and the city's rumor machine warms up like a kettle dot, and then there's the shadow of the court, where politics makes every illness feel like a suspect story, because succession turns natural death into a convenient opportunity. Imperial households were crowded with tasters, doctors, servants, rivals, relatives, too many hands around a single meal, too many eyes on a single mouthful. In that environment, a poison economy thrives even if most murders are imagined, because paranoia pays well. You don't need constant poisonings to fear them. You only need a few believable ones, and then the fear does the rest of the work quietly, night after night, like a fountain that never stops running. This is the gentle trick of it. The belief in poison reshapes behavior, and behavior is the real product. People develop routines. They create procedures. They watch who pours, who tastes, who touches the cup. They narrow trust until it becomes a thin thread, and then they wonder why everything feels tense. Kitchens become political spaces. Sickness becomes a question instead of a condition. Even honest medicine starts to look suspicious because the line between cure and harm is dosage and intent. And intent is the one thing you can't measure with a spoon. So daily life becomes a series of small precautions which feel like competence. The way checking your door twice can feel like wisdom, even if you're mostly just tired. And if you're expecting a dramatic ending, you won't get one here. Rome doesn't tie this up neatly, and neither do we. Instead, you can hold the whole story in one jar. Bottles, herbs, whispers. Hold it gently, like something fragile and annoying, like a glass that you don't want to drop because it will make too much noise. Imagine a small shop at dusk, shutters half closed. Jars labeled in careful script that looks important mainly because it is tidy. The air smells faintly of resin and wine and dried leaves that have been waiting a long time to be useful. Some customers come for sleep, some come for pain, some come for love, which is often just anxiety wearing perfume. Some come for revenge they won't name aloud because naming things makes them heavier. The fountain keeps running. The city keeps murmuring. Somewhere, a servant carries a message that is mostly silence. Somewhere else, a clerk writes a date on a document and believes the ink is telling the truth. And the bottle, innocent or not, disappears into a sleeve, not with a flourish, but with the soft practicality of ordinary shopping. If you want to end softly, you can imagine the jar returning to a shelf. The label facing outward, the room dimming by degrees, until the details blur into something comfortable, and the only thing left is the steady, mindless sound of water doing what it does, without needing anyone's permission. You might not expect a piece of iron to be one of the calmest objects in history, but a chain can be surprisingly soothing when it's doing absolutely nothing heroic. It just lies there, patient and slightly cold, with the quiet confidence of an object that knows it will still be needed tomorrow. A candle makes a small, polite sound. A wooden table remembers the weight of elbows. Somewhere, a key turns with the kind of gentleness that suggests the person turning it doesn't want to startle the books. If your room is still, let it stay that way. And if it isn't, you can imagine a room that is a library room, not the dramatic kind with secret doors and mysterious whispers, but the stubbornly practical kind. Thick walls, narrow windows, air that smells faintly of dust and ink, and wool that dried too slowly. There's a book on a lectern, and the book is attached to the lectern by a chain, like a mildly overprotected pet. People sometimes call this a chained library, which sounds like a place where novels are punished for misbehaving, but it's really just a place where books are expensive and walking away is considered rude. The curiosity here is gentle. Why would you chain a book, of all things, the way you might chain a gate or a bucket? And the answer is quietly boring, which is exactly what we want. Books were valuable in a very particular way. Not luxury watch valuable, but this took months of human labor and a lot of materials valuable. Paper and parchment were not casual. Ink was not casual. And the skill of copying, correcting, and binding was not casual either. So the book becomes less like a disposable object and more like shared property that needs a little supervision. The way a communal kitchen needs someone to notice if the salt disappears. If you're still awake in a bit, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. A medieval librarian would have understood that sleepy indecision. In fact, the medieval librarian would have respected it, because their entire profession depended on people intending to do one thing and then drifting into another. A reader comes in to look up one small fact, then spends an hour staring at a margin note, then leaves with the vague feeling that they have learned something, though they can't quite say what. Now the chain itself is a wonderfully unglamorous object. It's not the heavy, clinking chain of a prison movie. It's often thinner, more like a firm reminder than a threat. Links are small and repetitive, like someone's idea of a calming pattern. The chain is fixed to the cover or the edge of the binding with a metal fitting, and then fixed to a rod or a ring on the desk. It allows the book to open and be read, but not to wander. It's basically the earliest form of "please don't take this home," except it's written in iron rather than in polite signage. And the funny thing is that it changes the physical experience of reading. You don't pick up the book and crow into a corner. You stand or sit where the book tells you to sit. The book remains in place like an elderly relative who refuses to move because the chair is just right. This creates a certain reading posture, shoulders forward, hands on the page, attention anchored. It's a little like using a desktop computer after years of laptops. The book doesn't come with you. You go to the book. You adjust yourself around it, and after a few minutes, your brain accepts the arrangement, because brains are highly adaptable, especially when there's nothing else to do. A small detail that makes this even more charmingly inconvenient is the way the books are arranged. In many chained libraries, the spines face inward and the foredges face outward, because the chain is attached in a way that makes that orientation practical. So instead of browsing by reading spines, you browse by reading titles written on the edge, or by guessing, or by asking someone who knows. Which is, in a quiet way, the entire history of research, mostly guessing, occasionally asking, and often pretending you planned it all along. The people who made this system work were not dramatic figures. They were the fixers, the whisperers, the middle hands of scholarship. Someone had to buy the iron. Someone had to make the chain the correct length, long enough to open the book comfortably, but short enough to prevent creative interpretations of borrowing. Someone had to attach it without ruining the binding. And someone had to notice when a link snapped, or when a clever reader developed a habit of loosening things with slow, patient fingers. There's also the librarian, or the keeper of books, who is often imagined as stern, but was probably more tired than stern. Their life is a series of small checks. Is the candle too close? Is the window letting in damp air? Did someone leave a book open like a sandwich? They have keys. They have lists. They have the oddly powerful ability to say, no, that one stays here, with the calm authority of a person who has said it 1,000 times. They're the original gatekeepers, except the gate is a book and the fence is a chain. And then there are the readers, who are not a single type of person. There are students who arrive with that jittery energy of someone who thinks learning can be accomplished by speed. There are older scholars who move slowly, as if each step costs a small coin. There are clerics, merchants, officials, anyone who needs text. Some readers treat the chain as a comfort. It means the book will be there tomorrow. Some treat it as an insult. It implies they can't be trusted. Which is funny, because the chain isn't personal, it's just policy. The chain is the bureaucrat of the library, quietly enforcing rules without ever making eye contact. Every 30 or 60 seconds, history offers a small absurdity, so here is one. Chained libraries sometimes had rules about how you were allowed to turn pages. The rule wasn't always written down, but you can imagine it anyway. Because humans love inventing rules for anything fragile. Don't lick your fingers too much. Don't press too hard. Don't help the ink by tracing it with your nail. And if you absolutely must sneeze, please aim away from the manuscript, as if the manuscript is a noble guest who shouldn't be offended by your lungs. This is not heroic, but it is very real, and it is a kind of silent drama that never raises its voice. As the night goes on, the system becomes even more procedural. The chain is only part of the story. The real machinery is the paperwork. A chained library often comes with a catalog, and catalogs are the most quietly exhausting genre of writing ever invented. A catalog is not a story. It does not build tension. It does not resolve. It simply lists, like a person reading out loud what's inside their pantry. Title, author, sometimes the first words, sometimes the subject, sometimes a note like missing a page, which is the librarian's version of a tragic poem. There might be a record of donations. There might be a record of repairs. There might be a note about a book that is chained because it is frequently used, which is a gentle compliment and also a warning. If you've ever tried to find a document in a modern folder system, you already understand the emotional landscape. You click. You scroll. You think it must be here. You consider naming conventions. You consider giving up. Medieval people did the same thing, just with different furniture. They would look at a shelf. They would read the edge. They would squint at handwriting. They would ask the keeper. The keeper would sigh in a way that suggests this question has been asked since the dawn of time. And then, slowly, the book would be located like a shy animal coaxed out of hiding with patience. The legal side of this is also very sleepy, because rules about books tend to be written in a tone that implies everyone is slightly disappointed in everyone else. Some libraries required pledges, some required collateral, some limited access hours. Some insisted you wash your hands, which is good advice in any century, though it's rarely followed with enthusiasm. The chain is the most literal rule, but it sits alongside other rules that are just as firm. Don't remove pages, don't mark too heavily, don't treat the margins like your personal diary. Of course, people still did. People always do. And the margins, even now, are full of evidence that readers were human, bored, amused, irritated, and occasionally inspired to draw a small creature that looks like a lopsided dog. There's a micro hook hidden in that. A chained book can still be defaced. You can chain the object, but you can't chain the impulse to doodle. The chain can prevent theft, but it cannot prevent commentary. A reader can't take the book home, but they can leave a trace of themselves behind, like a quiet fingerprint of personality. Sometimes it's a note correcting an error. Sometimes it's a complaint. Sometimes it's a prayer. Sometimes it's just a name, written as if the person is proving to themselves that they were here, and that the book saw them. And then you reach the last scene, which is the after-hours feeling of a library. The readers leave, the room empties, the air becomes less stirred, the candles go out one by one, and the dark returns like a patient blanket. The chained books remain where they are, each one tethered in calm silence, like a little row of sleeping animals that have agreed not to wander. The keeper checks the chains, not because they expect trouble tonight, but because routine is how you keep anxiety from growing teeth. They listen for the small rattle of metal. They look for anything unusual. Then they lock the door with the familiar satisfaction of ending a day with one clear action. If you want a soft modern analogy, it's a bit like logging out, like shutting a laptop and knowing the files will be there tomorrow, like putting your phone on a charger and watching it become still. The chain is the physical reminder that this knowledge belongs to a place, not to a person. It's communal. It's shared. It waits. And that waiting is oddly comforting because it suggests continuity, the idea that something can remain available without being owned. Chain libraries still exist in a few places, and if you ever stand in one, the feeling is less spooky and more quietly funny. You realize how much effort went into simply keeping things from being lost. Not saving the world, not winning a war, just preventing the slow disappearance of pages and bindings and carefully arranged knowledge. The chain becomes a symbol of a society learning how to manage valuable information with the tools it had: metalwork, rules, human attention, and a deep faith in the power of a locked door. And if you let your mind drift, you can imagine the sound the chains might make if the room were moved by wind. A faint clink like someone tapping a spoon against glass, testing whether the world is still there. The fountain outside keeps running. The city keeps making its soft, ordinary noises. Inside, the books remain tethered, not because they are guilty, but because they are precious in a very slow way. The labels face outward. The edges wait to be read. The catalog sleeps somewhere in a drawer, full of titles that will be found again eventually when someone wakes up curious and just a little bit tired. And if you want to end softly without conclusions, you can picture the last candle going out, the last key turning, the last footstep fading down a corridor, and then the room settling into stillness so complete it almost feels like a sound. The chains don't move. The books don't move. The air doesn't even try. Everything simply waits, calmly, for the next reader to arrive and lean in close and begin the slow, gentle act of paying attention, until attention itself becomes heavy and you let it go.